I live in Columbia, South Carolina. My son is Will. He's 21 and living with dyslexia, ADD, dyscalculia, and some memory issues. And I have a two-part question. In what part of the job interview process should a recent college graduate disclose their disability if it may impact their job responsibilities in some way? And the second part is, if this person chooses not to disclose their disability and they are hired and they seem to be having some difficulty with some of their job responsibilities, what should happen then? What protections do they have?
Hello, my name is Dr. James Williams. I'm the Chief Operating Officer and National Pre-TS Director at Bloom Consulting. We're an organization based in Texas that has worked with individuals that are neurodiverse and or that have disabilities for the last 12 to 13 years, providing vocational evaluation services, job placement, job development, vocational consultation services, and job training and support. And I will tell you, the tough part about the answers to these questions is they're not an exact science. So it really does depend on the job. It really does depend on the individual. But that said, I will tell you the advice that I give the folks that we work with. So first of all, I always tell people to evaluate themselves, the challenges that they have, the strengths they have, and do they feel like that those strengths or challenges will be a barrier to them being successful in the job? If the answer is no, or even I don't think so, then I tell a lot of the clients that we work with, then you don't have to make that decision to disclose. You can choose to wait and see how it goes, and really only do so if you feel things change or you feel the need to. And there's some caveats to that I'll answer in the second to the second part of your question. But that's the deal there. However, if you're an individual that has either had challenges in the past on a job site, had any work history challenges or maintaining employment for a long duration in the past, and or if you feel like, hey, despite my best efforts, it's at some point it's probably going to be either obvious or there's going to be some type of issue or challenge on the job site, and I just feel like that's going to happen. If you're in that camp, I really do advise that you disclose in the interview process after questions. Usually there's an opportunity during interviews for the person to ask a question. And that is a great time that I usually tell folks that it's a good time to say, well, I don't have a question, but I wanted to ask something or wanted to share something with you. It's a totally appropriate time to do that. And then, share that information. In sharing that information, I would encourage it to be a brief explanation. I tell our clients and parents all the time, employers are not disability experts. They're not doctors, medical professionals. They're not neurologists. They don't need a 6-page psych report verbally. They need, hey, either A, I have XYZ disability, so tell them what it is. This is how that affects me, and this is the type of support I may need. And you can say may, because you're not sure, I may need on the job. Or some of our clients aren't comfortable sharing the actual disability, and that's okay. So you don't have to even sometimes say with an employer, I'm just going to pick a disability, ADHD or neurodiverse condition, or even something such as an autism spectrum disorder. You don't have to do that. You can say, I have a disability, be very generic, and then say, this is how it may affect me, and this is the type of support I may need to be successful in this position. So those are the two ways to go about it, or the way to go about it if you're going to choose to disclose. And then, of course, to answer the second kind of angle of your question of if you choose not to disclose. Okay, so that's the first part of the answer. Here's the second part of the answer to your question. That's where it gets challenging. So you asked what kind of protections are there if the person chooses not to disclose and the individual has any challenges or anything that they need support in from the employer in terms of accommodations. That's where it gets tough, because technically speaking, the Americans with Disabilities Act says that the individual has to disclose prior to receiving the accommodations or support. And technically, the individual isn't covered or protected by the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, until they choose to disclose. So that means that if an employer is, for instance, if an employer has some challenges with an employee, they have not disclosed, and they start writing them up or documenting these issues. If just because the person says, let's say, and by the way, this has actually happened to some of our clients. They call our client into the office, and the employer has the intention of letting them go. But the individual knows that and basically tries to save their own job by saying, hey, I have a disability, Technically speaking, the employer, you just disclosed, so you weren't exempt not exempt, you weren't protected by ADA. That's not exempt, that's a bad word. You weren't protected by ADA until you disclosed. And so those issues and any challenges or any mistakes that were made that the employer is kind of looking at as strikes against that employee, they can be upheld. And honestly, that the employee can choose to, or the employer, excuse me, can choose to terminate because the person did not disclose. So I will say that is a risk that you run if you choose to wait to disclose. However, your question was protections in general. Protections in general are after you disclose, you're protected by the Americans with Disabilities Act. And that means that the employer must offer and provide what the term we use is, or the law uses, is reasonable accommodations in terms of disability. And you may ask, well, great, what does reasonable mean? Well, like everything in life, that's the interpretation part. So it gets a little tricky. Some employers may say one accommodation is reasonable. One other employer may say, no, it's not reasonable. And so that does get a little bit tricky there. Generally speaking, in the field of vocational rehabilitation, in my field, we have a couple of tests that we use. One is the accommodation excessively expensive or excessively prohibitive for the employer to implement? Because if it is not, generally speaking, when ADA case law has went forward and trials and things have happened and cases have happened, if it was exorbitantly expensive or prohibitive for the employer, generally speaking, those cases have been decided in favor of the employer. So you have to be careful. However, if it's an accommodation that is really more of a procedural change, or it's something that is of no cost or low cost to the employer, those generally are protected accommodations and the employer should comply with them. And those are cases where I've actually told our clients, you need to, if the employer doesn't follow through, you do have the option of filing a complaint with the Office of Civil Rights and actually filing a complaint and saying the employer is not accommodating me per the law. So that's kind of how that piece can work. So there is protection there once that disclosure is made, but it doesn't mean an employer has to just do anything the employee says as an accommodation. Give you an example. We've had customers that have said, well, as an accommodation, if I'm late, I don't get in trouble. No. An accommodation example though could be, I have frequent doctor's appointments, and sometimes those appointments occur quickly. And so if I'm able to get into my doctor, I may have to miss work or be out sick with not a lot of notice. That is an accommodation. That is an accommodation an employer should work with. So that's an accommodation. But no, I'm just late, or no, I run late a lot. That's not an accommodation. That's not something employers have to do. Same with in terms of pay and compensation. An employer doesn't have to compensate someone with a disability at a higher rate because that's not an accommodation. So there's some real specific things. Probably last example I'd give, a day's paid time off. This is a really, really tricky one. So a lot of people will say, well, if my disability causes me to be out of work more, that should be an accommodation. It can and can't be, because here's the challenge. If you have paid time off or PTO as an employee, they can ask you to use that PTO. They don't have to give you extra time off because of your disability. That's not an accommodation. They can say, well, you can be off, but you need to use your days like every other employee. They also don't have to give you more days because you have a disability. They can also say, well, you can be off, but at this point you've used all your days, so you're going to have to take unpaid leave, or if it's very long-term, something like the FMLA, Family Medical Leave Act. So that's just something to keep in mind with that question. So I know that was a long answer, but I promise you that is the shortest you can answer that question, because it is a really difficult question. What I always tell people is, at the end of the day, you ever have a question about that, there are disability rights and disability law attorneys that actually specialize in this kind of law and are very, very familiar with the case law and the background. So you can always get professional help from a lawyer and somebody who has this background if you ever have an issue or you really want to dig into to that question. But yeah, thank you so much again, and fantastic question, and thank you so much for it, and I hope I answered it for you.